On today's episode of the Fandom Science Podcast, we talk about leadership in sports and the many lessons that we can draw from that topic and apply it in our daily lives. So we talked about the different types of leadership that are common in sports, personality traits that are associated with leadership, good leadership behaviors that promote team cohesion and trust, and whether being a leader is something that you're born with or something that you develop over time. All of that and more with Dr. Todd Loughead, a leadership expert and a sports psychologist from the University of Windsor, Canada. I hope you guys enjoy this episode, and if you do, please make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for the best sports science content. So what got you into leadership? Like, how did you decide that this is going to be the field that I'm going to specialize in?
Well, how I got involved in it was back in my PhD, I worked with Bert Karen at Western University. And Bert Karen was renowned for being a group dynamics researcher and a real pioneer in the field, not just in Canada, but worldwide. So I hooked up with him, and really my journey into leadership started through group dynamics and through something called cohesion, or that team chemistry kind of variable. And from there, just from coaching when I was younger and going into my PhD, I always had this fascination with, coaching and leadership, and amongst the athletes, leadership that they provided. And that's really how I got into it. And so a lot of what I do is look at this idea of leadership through really a group dynamics kind of perspective. That's kind of the lens I take.
Right. And so, leadership has, I guess it depends on like different contexts. It might have different meanings. Like if we look at the business world, it might be different from sports, from, the military and so on and so forth. But how is leadership defined in sports psychology? So as far as sports psychology is concerned, like what does it mean to be a leader?
Right. So there's really not much difference from those contexts that you just talked about, whether it be the military or business or sport. They're very similar, actually. And I think we're all borrowing from each other, actually. So in the most basic form, when we talk about leadership, it's about influencing others towards a common goal. And that, when you take that perspective, then you can apply it to sport, to military, to business, to being in a music band even. So you can really apply it to whatever context you're in.
Right. So oftentimes, like we think about leadership, and myself included, I used to think this way before I really dove deep into this idea, but we often think about it as this one trait or this one thing. But in reality, it comes in many different shapes and takes many different forms. Among them is transformational leadership, there's transactional leadership. And do you mind describing each one and what they entail, what the differences between them?
Right. So I'll start off maybe with the transactional leadership. I think for a lot of people listening and watching this, they'll be more familiar with that. And, in sport, what it would look like would be, let's say a coach, will reward his or her players because, the coach said, I want you to go out and do this and execute it this way. And if you do, then I'll give you more, perhaps you'll get more playing time. Right. So that's the transaction that occurs. If you do this for me, then you will be rewarded with this. And if you don't do this for me, then perhaps you'll be punished in some way, maybe less playing time or less, in hockey, like less power play time or penalty kill time. So that's the transaction that occurs between, it's kind of like the deal between the two parties, okay, between the coach and the athlete, let's say, right? Whereas transformational, the name really implies what it's getting at. It's this idea of taking the people you're leading and making them, obviously better, in the sense of maybe making them the future leaders down the road, or inspiring them in some way, being a positive role model for them. But it's really trying to elevate them to a higher level. Right. And that's really the difference between the two. And what I would say on that front is, to be a successful leader, you have to do both. right? I think what we tend to forget sometimes is that we want to be always this positive and transformational type of leader, but that's not always possible. There are times when we need people. Okay, if you do this, then you're going to get more playing time, or I'm going to trust you more, or something. And there's that transaction. So we have to do both types. What we don't know, though, is we know it's important to do both types, but what we don't know is what's that right mix between the two to be a successful leader. And maybe down the road we'll look at that in some of our research, but right now we know they're both important. We just don't know what the right balance is between the two.
Right. And so, but you, in your opinion, you would think that maybe recently transactional has been a bit overlooked just because everybody's trying to be positive and supportive and transformational?
Well, I think the pendulum swung for many, many years. It was the transactional was what we historically knew. That one was like, it's like the stick and carrot approach, right? Like you're chasing that carrot, and if I do well, I'll get rewarded for it. And then the pendulum swung, and we went more to this transformational, and we kind of forgot about the transactional. And what we have found in some of our research in sport, anyways, is that the most successful leaders will use a combination of both. And some of our research, when we've asked the athletes, how important are these transformational and transactional leadership behaviors? And not if they're happening, but just tell us how important they are. What we found was that they rate both the transformational and the transactional equally as important.
Right.
So it goes to show you that you do have to have that balance.
Yeah, and I think you're right about kind of throwing out the baby with the bathwater there with the transactional, because for a long time, not only in sports but outside of sports, transactional was the way to go. Like you do something right, you're rewarded. You do something wrong, you're punished. And of course, there's a lot of flaws in that, but it doesn't mean that you should throw away all the benefits of it too, because as humans, we still need that motivation of reward and or even the motivation of not being punished.
Correct. And what you see that transactional. I'm a soccer fan, and a player might not be having a great game, and you'll notice they'll get subbed early on in the game. And it's usually because, well, they're not performing. So they haven't held up to their end of the bargain. And so what the coach or manager is going to do is, make that substitution. And what you hope then is that they'll talk to the player, perhaps after the game and debrief and use, okay, so the transaction was, you didn't do what I said, so I substituted you. But then the transformational part is teaching them, here's the why I had to do it, why wasn't it working, why you didn't execute this way. And that would be the more transformational part then, right? And that's why I think to be an effective leader, you got to have strong communication skills between yourself and whoever you're leading.
Yeah, I think communication is absolutely key. And that brings us to the next point is, I want to ask you about what are the good, effective leadership behaviors that have been identified in sports psychology. Before we get into the before we get into the behaviors, maybe it's better if we talk about the personality traits and then we can go into behaviors. So has there been any personality or characteristic traits that have been identified that good leaders have within them?
Yeah, great question. And the simple answer is no, there's not a common personality trait out there, right? What we have found in some of our research, and that hasn't been published yet, but what we found was there's a common personality test called the Big Five, and it measures things like neuroticism, which is that idea of self-consciousness and impulsiveness and that sort of thing, or extroversion, which people are more outgoing or cheerful, and agreeableness, which is that feeling of being trustworthy or unselfish, and being conscientious or open to experiencing new things. And that's what makes up the Big Five in a nutshell. And when we have used this this tool to find out, okay, does it predict certain leadership behaviors? There's no pattern to it. And so again, what it really points to is that there's not one personality trait. It's that combination. And you probably want to have, to some degree, all of these things will help you be a better leader, right? If you're cheerful, if you're outgoing, if you're organized, if you're, attentive and creative. And so again, there's not going to be that one prototypical personality trait.
That's really interesting. So even speaking from my experience, I did the personality test a while ago, and okay. I can't remember what I scored on the other four, but I remember agreeableness, and I was in the 97th percentile in agreeableness. And so I know that that's probably not the best thing, not the best score to have if I want to be an effective leader, because part of agreeableness is empathy and feeling for other people's emotions, and I think that's great for leadership. But as far as being that agreeable to that extreme level, it's probably not that beneficial, if I was to guess. What do you think?
Well, maybe to some degree, right? But there's other components of it that are quite desirable for a leader, right? That being unselfish, right? I think to be a good leader, you want to be unselfish, right? You're there to serve others. And I think that's an important quality to have. But I think maybe some of those other personality traits would then help balance everything out.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, a part of leadership is sometimes making this decision that's not popular among people, but it's just the necessary thing to do. And I think maybe if you're conscientious, then that would work for you. If you're too agreeable, at that high of a level, then maybe that will work a bit against you. But I guess finding the balance is...
Well, I think you're right. I think one of the toughest tasks of a coach, of a captain, is making unpopular decisions. There's absolutely no doubt about that. It's tough, right? But I think if you can explain that decision and provide a rationale for it, people might not obviously still like the decision, but they might understand where you're coming from. And living through this pandemic right now, we've seen that, right, where decisions are made for the good of people, right? Whether it's mask wearing or something to that effect, right? We don't want to do it necessarily, but we understand why we have to do it. And because of that, because of the leadership has explained that to us, the health professionals or politicians, then we can go along with it and say, yeah, you know what, this makes sense. I get hot. I don't like covering my mouth like this, but it makes a lot of sense because it has been explained to us that this is a good thing. It's a necessary thing. And so we go with it. And I think the same thing applies to sport. Like coaches have to make decisions, or captains make decisions, and they might be at times unpopular, but if it's explained, if it's for the good of the team, then we can go along with it.
Yeah, so I guess that goes back to communication and just how important it is, especially in those times when you make an executive decision and it's not popular. That's when it's most important to communicate and say, this is why I made it. These are the circumstances we're under, and then that communication makes it better.
Correct, right? And we see that. I think when you have a strong leadership team, and let's say in the dressing room, then the communication becomes that much more open, right? Because the message might not be coming just from one or two players, but from a core group of players. And when you maybe have that consensus, then it's easier to everyone getting on the same page and at least pulling in the same direction.
So going back a bit to the Big Five, and like you mentioned, we don't know which makeup you should have between all those Big Five in order to be an effective leader. But if we were to find that out, I think we would have to break up those Big Five into just smaller fragments, maybe, because the Big Five are literally Big Five. They're just too big to kind of deduce them into little parts that predict leadership better. So even Yeah, so even like conscientiousness, and it's comprised of being organized or being having good work ethic and stuff like that. Well, we don't know which one of those little parts can predict leadership better.
Yeah, and I would totally agree with you on that, Lou. And one of the, and this was our first attempt at using the Big Five to help, predict some of our leadership behaviors that we've been interested in over the years. And you're right. I think if you can break it down to the more specific, the better off you are. And a lot of times that's been a challenge in our leadership behavior research, is that we have so many behaviors that it can make it challenging at times from that standpoint. But I totally agree with your point, and I think the more specific we are, the more informed we are then, and it's better for helping, in terms of interventions or anything practical that we want to, educate athletes or coaches about.
Mm-hmm. So speaking of behaviors, then what are some of the good leadership behaviors that sports psychology has identified?
Yeah, so right now we've identified over a dozen of leadership behaviors, and that's not to say that there's not more out there. So just throwing that out to begin with, but some of the behaviors that we have found that people might be familiar with would be things like being a good role model. That is one of the big ones in sport, right? When we talk to our athletes, so what can you do to be an effective leader? Well, I can be a really good role model, and a lot of times they'll say lead by example, right? We hear that a lot from our athletes. So that's what role modeling is about, leading by example. Other ways that athletes can be leaders is social support, so being supportive of your teammates, positive feedback, so encouraging them. Some of those athletes that I've come across are really good at breaking down skills and strategies and techniques and tactics of the sport. And there's another behavior that they can do. And then, we have more of those transformational that we talked about earlier, but things like motivating our teammates, making sure that they're still excited and want to keep contributing and keep working hard and persevering. Again, those are some of the behaviors that that we've been looking at over several years now. So again, there's so many, and we think there's probably more out there, but right now what we're able to measure is well over a dozen.
Right. And so going back to being the role model and leading by example, and I used to, like in the past, I used to think that that's kind of a cliche, but recently I've started to realize just how important and real that effect is. And I was listening to Elliot Friedman, who's a hockey insider and a reporter, and he was saying how in the Carolina Hurricanes dressing room, the fact that their coach, Rod Brindamore, is in such good shape that rubs off on the players, and they actually follow him and follow his work ethic as far as training and staying in shape, recovery, and all of that. And so I used to not doubt it, but I used to look at it as a cliche, but recently I've started to realize that's the real thing.
I was exactly like you when I first started researching in this area, and I would hear those cliches, right? I gotta lead by example. I think if we start peeling that's where you start to see what leading by example means, right? It means having a good work ethic, and that could take on different forms, right? Being on time for practice, doing workouts afterwards, eating well, sleeping well. So it's about, okay, leading by example. I think again is such a cliche, but to me it's what comes with it. Okay, so what do we mean by leading by example? And it's about those things, right? And you hear a lot of times, young players will say, I had a player, an older player on the team who mentored me and basically showed me how to be a professional. And again, I take that from a research perspective and say, okay, it's about they're showing them how to be a professional. So how to go about your business, how to, work on and off the ice, how to be a better player, a practice player, how to be a better professional off the ice, how to, take care of your body on those off days, or things of that sort, right? So again, I think if we were to ask athletes that, they would give us some of those insights like that.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of lessons to draw here, even for non-athletes. Because I mean, sports, like, you can take a million life lessons from it and apply it in real life, and this is one of them. If you find yourself in a managerial position or leader position at some point, it's so important to show the team that you lead the behaviors, or like your work ethic or your practices or your routines, because if you do the opposite of that, but then you preach to the team that you should be doing this and that, well, your message is not going to resonate with them because you don't do that yourself.
Correct. And what I would add to that is, what people want to see nowadays is people who are authentic or genuine. And that's what they expect from their leaders, right? Because they don't want, yeah, you tell me to do this, but you don't do it yourself. And you're right. We want people who lead us, that they're, transparent, trustworthy, genuine, authentic, that they're making what they're saying is what they also live by. And I think that that's pretty important. And I've coached, I lead my research team here at the university, and I try to practice what I preach. And I think that is so important, whether we're coaching, youth sport all the way up to the pros, and then, in your own, you know, personal life, or leading a business group, or what have you. You got to practice what you preach, and that way you come across as, again, as genuine, authentic, and then people can get behind that.
Yeah, and it's so interesting that you said that these days there's more need for genuinity and being authentic. And not that I know how things were 50 years ago, but I do feel like as time advances, there is more need for being authentic in everything. And I'm not sure why this is happening. Maybe social media plays a role. Maybe, I don't know. But yeah, I think these days there's more need for that.
Well, I like to think hopefully we're getting better. We're evolving, right? And I see this a lot when I talk to athletes and coaches. We'll have conversations about, okay, what has changed, coaching nowadays. And probably the biggest thing that coaches say, they'll say athletes want to know why we're doing something like this. Whether it's a drill in a practice, or some sort of strategy for gameplay. And the athletes want to know why. When I was growing up, you would never question the coach. The coach was had a lot of power, and you respected that. And you just, whatever the coach said, you went out and did it. And I think for the good, that athletes want to know the why now. Why are we doing this? They're far more curious, inquisitive about that. And if you can give them the why, then you can probably get a pretty good buy-in.
Yeah. And I was listening to the author of, I think it's called Cracking the Leadership Code. I'm not sure if that's the right title or not, but he was on a podcast and he was saying how these days, like people these days of those new generations, and I guess that includes me, but they look for authenticity and being genuine in everything, and sports is one of those things. And he was saying, even if you look at the consumer behavior of people, they, newer generations like to support businesses that have a mission, like businesses that use only recycled materials, businesses that donate some of their profit to those organizations, so on and so forth. And there's just been this huge shift in people's need for transparency and authenticity. And this is just one of them. I guess athletes are, they're also part of this generation, and they look for those things in their sport and their profession.
Absolutely. And, I don't know much about this area, but this idea of like being a good corporate citizen, right?
Yeah.
We want to get involved or latch on to things that that are meaningful to us, that have value to us. And and that's why, and sport is one good thing where, a lot of professional sport teams give back to the community, right? And I think athletes can easily get on board with that, right? And they could have had a tough, a tough game the night before, or get banged up, bruised, and got home late from a trip, but the next morning they're at the children's hospital, and they're giving back because, hopefully the team as an organization has said, this is what we value, we're going to give back, our fans give us so much, we have to give back. And I think the players can buy into that, right? That idea, we'll give back, we'll be good corporate citizens, and we'll do our part, to help those perhaps that are, less fortunate than us, or something like that. And again, that's showing good role modeling. It's showing good corporate citizenship. So yeah, totally can see why, players want to get behind this, and get on these initiatives that hopefully make us, society a little better.
Yeah. And as easy as it is to get cynical sometimes about those things, especially when it comes to professional sports, because it's easy to say, oh, well, this is a PR move. This is, for publicity and all that stuff. No, I would like to give them benefit of the doubt and say, like, no, they're doing some really good humanitarian work, and it should be celebrated.
I think you're right. And I think that most athletes they do realize how fortunate they are to be, doing what they do. They do it well. A lot of professionals get compensated well for it. And they recognize that they have the values that, I'm going to give back. And, a lot of them will start foundations for their charities, and try to raise money to help those in need. And what a great thing. And I know we can become easily cynical and say this is a great PR move, and it's for their branding and whatnot. But I don't know. I think those athletes who do it for a sustained period of time, they genuinely want to give back. Part of the problem is, though, they get so many requests, I'm sure, and it probably makes it tough, to do everything, for everyone. But I really believe that they do want to give back, and they try to be, good leaders in that sense, in their own way. And everyone does it a little differently, probably.
Yeah, and a lot of them do it behind the scenes too. There's no cameras and there's no nothing, and they do it out of the goodness of their heart, and that's amazing too.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So the reason I was asking you about good leadership behaviors is not only so that we can learn what a good leader looks like, but also I was wondering, if I'm scouting a player leading up to the draft, let's say, I'm identifying my pool of prospects, and I want to know which one of them has good leadership skills or could potentially be a good leader for my team in the future. What are the things that I should be looking at here? And aside from having them fill out a questionnaire, which we're going to get to in a little bit, but aside from that, as far as observing behaviors, what are the things that I should be looking for?
So it's a really difficult question to ask. It's a really good question. It's a difficult one because leadership is very complex. And as we've shown, in our discussion today, it can take on so many different forms. And so it's hard to pinpoint, the one or two things to look for, in a potential, draft pick.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it all depends too on what, let's use the NHL. There's, 31 teams coming, 32 now, with Seattle joining, and everyone, I'm sure all those organizations will say, leadership is important. We want to have, players who can demonstrate some sort of leadership potential. Now, I'm sure that there's probably 32 different ways they're going to evaluate that, and that's the tricky part. So, if a club ever contacted me and asked me this question, I would, first of all, want to know from a potential draft pick. I would, ask some of the questions about, okay, what does leadership mean to you? And I would be looking for those behaviors that I talked about earlier. That would be one that I'd be really curious about. A second area I'd be asking about is this idea of authenticity. Okay, so again, you can do all these leadership behaviors, but if you don't do them with in an authentic or genuine way, you're not going to be an effective leader. Okay, so you have the leadership behavior on one hand that I'd be interested in. You have this idea how trying to figure out how genuine or authentic they are, and probably the third one I would tackle would be trying to get a sense of their emotional intelligence. And that we talked a little bit about earlier when we talked about this idea of empathy. And that's one component of being an emotionally intelligent person, is this idea of empathy. And there's some other components to it. But if we can, for me, I'd be tackling those three areas. And I think in doing so, what we would be tapping into is not only leadership, but also their character. And I think teams are very interested in a player's character. They want to make sure that they're going to draft somebody who is a solid, person with good morals, good values, who hopefully has good leadership potential, and they're going to be a good fit for our organization. And I think so. If a club called me, those would be the three areas I'd be, tackling for that club.
Yeah. Can we expand a little bit more on emotional intelligence? Because it's kind of like I think it's, even for experts themselves, it's not really like that well understood of a concept. But what does it really mean to be an emotionally intelligent person, aside from like being empathetic, which we talked about?
Right. So this idea of being emotionally intelligent is this notion of being able to manage your emotions and the ability to manage emotions in others. And in the context of sport, probably in the context of trying to win. Okay, so it's really a two-pronged view here. One is you got to be able to handle your own emotions, and on the other hand, how can you manage the emotions of others? So that's the two components, and that and then within that, you really get various components to it. Probably the most famous person or notable person to bring this to the mainstream was an author by the name of Daniel Goleman, and he talked about this idea of emotional intelligence, that it contains obviously what we just talked about, the ability to manage yourself, and that would be being self-aware, so knowing your strengths and weaknesses as a leader, and then from a behavioral standpoint, be able to self-regulate those emotions. So, managing your own impulses and internal states. Sometimes we get angry. How can we control that? How can we make it not detrimental to our performance? And then in terms of the more managing others, here it's really being socially aware. And so it's things like empathy, right? Being aware of other people's feelings, their needs, their concerns, and being able to address them. And then the second component to that would be like being strong in your social skills. And so again, we've talked about being able to communicate well, but also how to handle conflict, how to have good conflict resolution skills, being a good teammate, so being more cooperative, perhaps. So that's what we're getting at when we're talking about this idea of being emotionally intelligent.
Do you think that sometimes, speaking of scouting and drafting and all of that, do you think sometimes that leadership is misunderstood and often looked at as this must-have quality, when in reality, you need followers on your team? You can't have 25 guys be leaders, because then they're just going to clash. But do you think sometimes it's misunderstood as like, well, you got to have this quality? Well, what if you don't have it? Is that the worst thing?
No, it's not the worst thing. And how I like to explain it to people, and what our research has shown is So I take the perspective of that not everybody on a particular team may be a leader. Okay, so not everybody wants to be the captain or the assistant captain or part of that core group of leaders. So you have this notion of, okay, there's going to be people who are going to lead, and they're the leaders. Okay, fine. And what I try to also emphasize is what we can do, though, for those who might not wear the C or the A on their jersey, is let's develop leadership, though, in everybody. Okay, so even those people who are followers, let's develop their leadership potential. Okay, and knowing full well they're not going to be the captains down the road and that sort of thing. But what we're trying to do is create a more effective team environment, right? Of more positive behaviors that are happening, right? So a lot of these leadership behaviors that I talked about are really just good life skills to have. And so if you're, not comfortable being in a leadership role, you can still do these behaviors, right? You can still be encouraging your teammates. You can still, provide positive feedback. And I think what we have to get past is the notion that one leader is going to be able to do everything. It's just not possible. Like, as I said earlier, we have over a dozen of these leadership behaviors. How can one person do all of them well, right? And because they might not be comfortable with certain elements of being in that, doing that leadership behavior. And so that's why it's so important to kind of spread the wealth a bit and making sure you have a strong leadership group. But also for those people who don't want to be a part of that, teaching them the leadership behaviors just gives them good life skills. But then they can understand better when a leader might be coming to them and talking to them and saying, okay, I know where you're coming from. I understand this, right? And I would never want to not develop leadership in everyone, because what happens is at some point, maybe because you're a really good player, you're identified as a future captain, and perhaps that player doesn't want any of that, but yet there's somebody else who wants to, who is motivated to want to be a leader. And they might not be the best player, but why limit their growth and their potential? So for me, that it's an important distinction to make between what's a leader and what's leadership, because I think even in terms of followers, they can still do leadership. They might not do it all the time, but when it's necessary, they can step in and do it. And we talk a lot about in our research, shared leadership, this idea of a collective and coming in and out of leadership roles at times. So you might not be the best at explaining a strategy or a particular technique to your teammate, but you're really good at listening and showing that empathy and helping them through their problems. And so, if that's your strength, play to that strength, and you can be a leader in that way. So again, it's really this idea of a shared collective kind of leadership, and everyone pulling together in the same direction. Now, this idea of followership and whatnot, in some of our research, what we've done is that we've asked players, tell us the leaders on your team. And of course, when we do that, we get, there's always a couple that emerge that everybody thinks that's who the leader is. But what surprised us in a lot of ways was every athlete was rated or nominated by at least one teammate as being a leader. So again, it really points to this idea of being shared and collective. Of course, not everyone's going to do it to the same extent, but it's just amazing that every player on every team, or teams we've surveyed so far, that everyone's being asked to be they're viewed as a leader by their teammates in some capacity. And that's really fascinating. And again, so it really points to this idea, should we be developing the few or the many? And it would appear, let's develop as many as we can.
That's really interesting because I didn't think about it that way, because I thought, oh, maybe they're overvaluing leadership, or maybe they're kind of trying to distribute it among everyone. And in reality, they should focus on, the 2 or 3 leaders on the team. But when you explain just how important it is to have leadership qualities, not necessarily being an actual, leader, but just having those qualities in as many people as you can, just how good that would do for the team and for the cohesion, the trust in the team.
Exactly. And that's what we found, right? It really helps all those other team level variables, like the cohesion, the trust. A big one we've looked at is satisfaction as well. The athletes are more satisfied, when they feel there's this bountiful amount of leadership available to me. They're happier. So I think that there's a lot of good that can come from developing the many as opposed to the few.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think maybe one thing that stuck out to me too is when I asked you if I'm a scout, what I should be looking at, and you said, well, it's tricky because it's not like there's 1, 2, 3 that you look at and then that explains leadership. So that in itself is useful, because that's important for scouts to know that, hey, if you're looking at an athlete and you're looking at their leadership skills and you don't see what you think is leadership, doesn't mean that they don't have leadership, because there's also 100 other things that are so important to being a leader that you're not seeing. And what you don't see is as important as what you see.
Correct. And that's why it's so important to, if you're going to try to evaluate leadership, to really be comprehensive and as widespread as you can with it, because again, it's going to take on many different forms. And that's probably why, I think hopefully a good scout will try to ask as many different people as possible, because the coach might think one thing, but you ask a few players or, the equipment manager, and they might have a totally different, answer to that question. And so, you hear a lot. I know a few years ago when Alex Anthopoulos was the general manager of the Blue Jays, and they're looking to bring in some players, and Alex Anthopoulos would ask so many people about that person's character and their leadership. What would they bring to the clubhouse? And the idea was, you just don't ask a few people about them. Try to get a wide sample. And I know it was the clubhouse equipment manager, and it was anyone who would be in contact with this person. And I think that's pretty smart, because then you kind of get that whole picture of who that person is, maybe on a leadership capacity. So it's pretty neat.
Yeah, because I guess one person with their idea of leadership would shape their view of this player as a leader, whereas the equipment manager compared to the coach would have a different idea of what leadership is, and therefore a different perspective on this player and how good he is.
Totally. One of the big things when I work with some athletes, and they'll come and sit down with me, and we'll have a conversation, and they'll say, the coach wants me to be a leader, and that's pretty common. You hear that all the time. The coach wants me to step up and be a leader on this team, and the athlete has no idea what to do, right? And so, like I mentioned before, what I'll do with them is talk through these dozen or so leadership behaviors, and they'll go, wow, I didn't know that was leadership, because they think it's this almost this hero-like thing, right? You got to have a cape on and be above everybody. And yet, in a lot of ways, what it is, it's doing these leadership behaviors. Just do them really well, and it's not heroic, and that's probably how we viewed leadership many decades ago, is this idea of the leader being so much better than everyone else. And in a lot of ways, I'm glad we swung that pendulum to where we're at the point now of, you don't have to be this idea of a heroic leader. You just do these behaviors, they might seem like everyday kind of common sense behaviors, but do them extremely well, and you'll be effective then as a leader. And I think that that's huge, because a lot of times our athletes don't know what we want them to do from a leadership standpoint.
So that's really interesting. So I guess leadership is kind of, in a way, it's kind of like on ice or on field skills. Like, you don't ask if you're a shutdown defenseman and you're really good at preventing rushes against you and high quality chances. Okay, well then stick to that. Don't try to move the puck up the neutral zone and create a play and score goals. No, that's not your thing. Leave that to someone else. Stick with what you know and you'll be at your best. Same way with leadership. If you're the guy or the girl who's the best at communicating with teammates, caring for them, listening to their problems, helping them through social, professional, and personal things, stick to that. Maybe you don't have to be the rah-rah guy who sits in the locker room and yells and screams. Like, leave that to someone else.
Correct, and that's exactly. And I think your analogy of the shutdown defenseman is quite well taken here. Right? That's your role, that's your job, and the same thing can be applied to leadership. Do what you're comfortable with, what you feel you can do well, and that's how you're going to contribute to this idea of this shared leadership within the group. And that's exactly what we want, right? Don't go, we want players. We try to push players out of their comfort zone to get better, but at the end of the day, there's some players that will never be that rah-rah in the dressing room, that vocal leader. It's just not in them, but yet they might be a great one-on-one mentor for somebody, right? But they're just not comfortable speaking up like that in the dressing room. And it's probably more important on the team just to have that mix, right? Of people who will speak up in the dressing room when necessary, and those people who might do it a little more quietly on the side. And I think that's a really good point that you make there.
Right. So we're talking about shared leadership and how important it is to have different types of leaders. Would it be fair to call them like archetypes of leaders, let's say, on a team, or types, or whatever it may be? What are the types of leaders that have been identified in sports psychology that are good to have on the team? So we talked about like the good social support, and then technical, maybe lead by example. What else?
Yeah, well, if you have leaders who can be more, what we've called more task related. So those are probably the leaders who are more, really good at communicating or leading by example on the field, on the pitch, on the ice, on the court. And they're, lead by example really well in that context. They provide good technical or tactical, instructions or advice in that context. So anything that's related to helping the team perform better while doing the activity, right? The sport. That would be more your task. Then you got the leaders who are more like social. So more, the glue that maybe keeps the dressing room together. They're more the social convener, where they'll organize, team dinners and team get-togethers, and maybe keep everyone connected on social media and that sort of thing. And so you have those types of leaders, and then you got more your external leaders as well. So those are the leaders who are, don't mind talking maybe to the media, or being that team rep out in the community, and they're very comfortable in that role, right? They're kind of the face of the team or of the franchise, and they could also be liaising with the coaching staff as well. Okay, so that's the more external. You got leaders who are more change oriented, so they're trying to innovate and maybe get people to see problems from a whole different perspective, or get them to think about things differently, and maybe more progressively or something like that. So you have these different types of leaders that are kind of like the big five. Either probably a lot goes into them, but on the surface, I would say you have, like I just said, the social, the task, the external, the change type people, and and again, probably having a good mix within a team is probably a good thing.
Yeah, I was, and we touched on this a little bit ago, but I was just reading this paper about how having all those types of leaders on one team, and the more of those types of leaders that you have on a team, they're positively correlated with team confidence and even team performance and just overall satisfaction of everyone on the team.
Absolutely right. It's about having that, like you said, that balance, and I think that is key, right? Just like anything, you don't want to have too much of one thing. It probably hurts you in some capacity, right? A good analogy here would be like, the NHL. Like we have our typically our top six forwards who, they're there to generate the offense, and then you might have your third, fourth line. The third line maybe is a more of a defensive role on some teams that they'll shut down the other team's top line, and then the fourth line, if they can go out and maybe change the momentum or be that energy line, that's their role. Well, no different with leadership, right? It's probably having that mix is going to serve you best, and I think a lot of coaches get that, right? Yeah, or organizations get that. They really try hard to have that diversity within their dressing room, because ultimately it's going to help with their performance, and it's going to help the team play better. They're going to have the right mix, that right chemistry, and and I think the same thing applies to leadership. You want to have that mix, because that way it gives not everyone gets a chance to maybe get into a role that they're comfortable with. And if they can get into that leadership role that they're comfortable with, then they're going to contribute to the team more positively. And if they feel they can contribute to the team, then you get the idea of cohesion going up, of communication being more effective, and once that gets rolling, then I think the everyone feels good about themselves. They feel good about the team. They feel the team's everyone's pulling in the right direction, and then you have I think a pretty harmonious kind of group going on. So yeah.
And so that had me thinking: is the more and more I learned about how important it is to have like a shared leadership with different people taking on different roles. I remembered this about a year ago or so. A bunch of NHL players were surveyed about the importance of having a team captain. And I had to keep going back to the NHL, but that's what happens when you get two Canadians on a podcast, I guess. But so all those players were surveyed about the importance of having a captain. So just one guy with a C on his jersey, and how important that is to the team. And the votes were actually divided. I think it was like 50-50 or something, where some thought that having a captain is necessary and you got to have someone. And then others thought that no, it's okay if you don't have a captain as long as you got a leadership group. What would your thoughts be on having like this one primary leader as a captain? Like, is that necessary? Of course, we talked about leadership, shared leadership, and how important it is, and that's outside the question. But I'm saying as far as like having that one primary captain.
If we're talking within the context of hockey, it seems the answer is yes. We sport talk radio talks a lot about it, and we spend countless hours debating it. And I know that Toronto Maple Leafs went through this right before naming John Tavares as the captain.
Yep.
Right? Should have been Austin Matthews or Morgan Riley, or ultimately it ended up being John Tavares. I mean, I think we're really fascinated by this idea of someone wearing the C, and yet what I would say is you can make the argument that it is very important that you still want that one player that is maybe is kind of the organizer of all the other leaders, right? And so I think there's some validity in that, right? And hopefully that captain, let's say that John Tavares or whoever it is also comfortable sharing that leadership within the dressing room. And I think that's the case in a lot of teams that, I know in Montreal, like Shea Weber's the captain. There was so much debate. Should it have been Brendan Gallagher? Because he had been there for many years. And ultimately, Tavares got in Toronto and Shea Weber in Montreal. But yet these people spoke saying, I might be captain, but other people could have easily been given this honor. And what it speaks to then is that them saying, look, I might have the C on my jersey, but I'll also there's other great leaders in this room who could do a great job as well. And I think that's important. I think it might be important to have that one leader who can, like I said before, who can get everybody on the same page and pulling in the same direction, but knowing they're not going to be everything to everyone. And that's why it's important to have other people helping you out. And we've seen that a lot in our research where, the captain will say, I'm blessed by having such solid leaders surrounded, that I'm surrounded with. And they help me out tremendously. Because I know if I can't do this, I know this person can, and I'll send them to go and do that. And I think that's pretty important. That you get that mix of that. I know I keep saying that, but quite a few years ago, I heard Ken Holland speak, and the question was, how do you build a championship team? And obviously, he had some success there in Detroit for many years. And one of the things he said, look, obviously I'm a leader in all of this. And at the time, Mike Babcock was the coach of the Red Wings. And he said, Coach Babcock is a leader. But he said, really where the leadership really happens is within that dressing room amongst the players. He said, they're the ones who are always together. And he talked at the time that, I might have overpaid for a player to get that intangible quality of being a good leader and being and I'll have multiple players like that in my dressing room because they're so important towards building a championship club. And but he really saw it as a collective effort starting, with him as GM, going down to the coach, and then to the players, but everyone doing their thing. And he really felt the dressing room was so important, though, that, he was willing to overspend at times to get that right mix of leadership within the dressing room.
Because it's so important to have all of those qualities. It's unfair to have one person carry on all those roles anyway.
I think it's unfair. Again, going back to this idea of that person can't be everything to everyone. And what happens then when that player might, get injured or be suspended or whatever the case may be? You have to have others who can step in and fill that void. Mm-hmm. And you don't want to get caught shorthanded there, in a lot of ways, right? So it's a good thing that, hopefully you've got good leadership that can step in, but also grooming the next wave of leaders in your organization. And I think good organizations do that. Good teams do that, right? They plan ahead, like succession planning, like a lot of businesses do. I think the same thing can happen within a sport club that, this is a future leader of our club, but we're going to bring him or her along, slowly, appropriately, and down the road, they could be a leader on this club. And again, it really points to trying to, develop more than one person into that role.
Yeah, you're very right about businesses across all settings. The good ones who facilitate a good culture and a good leadership culture, they groom the up and coming leaders from earlier stages. They don't give them, too much responsibility to take on right away, just slowly but surely until they develop into competent leaders.
Correct. Yeah. And that's smart. That's smart training. I just think it's so smart, so prudent, and yet very responsible. And 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 I think the player, that's what they want. That's what they need. They don't need all that extra responsibility, that extra pressure put on them, because ultimately they're there to perform, and you don't want to detract from that. So, it's always tricky when you give a young player the captaincy because they're, a very good player. Um, you really got to know your team in order to do that, right? And we saw that in Edmonton. Like Connor McDavid was given the captaincy fairly early on, but you got to know, okay, can he handle it? And do we surround him also with other strong leaders to help him out and navigate what it is to be a good NHL captain?
Mm-hmm. That was going to be my next question, is Connor McDavid. So I have no doubt about his leadership ability or the respect that he has among his peers, especially that he's clearly the best player in the world. So he obviously commands respect from his peers and he can lead by example and all that. But I wanted to get your thoughts on, and we see this in professional sports all the time, where the team makes the best player on the ice their captain or their leader. Not on the ice necessarily, like whatever sport it might be. They make the best player the captain because he's the face of the franchise and he's got the most importance to the franchise. And not necessarily because they're genuinely the best leader, maybe. What do you think about that practice?
I think you got to be very careful, and for some players, yeah, they want it. They want it bad. They're hungry for it, and they can handle everything that comes with it. And for others, it's not for them. And a really good example of that. Okay, so we have the Connor McDavid, right, who I think embraced it, took it on, is a strong leader. On the other hand, you have somebody like Paul Pogba at Manchester United, who is a very talented player, very skilled. At United, pundits, critics would say Pogba's got to be a better leader. Okay. Because he was an expensive player, he's a very skilled player, but it doesn't seem to be in him. Okay. Because they bring in recently Bruno Fernandes, they brought him in, he's a midfield player. And what has happened is that he is viewed more now as the leader in the midfield, as opposed to Paul Pogba. And what has happened since Fernandes has been on with Manchester, it has freed Paul Pogba, that he doesn't feel that pressure responsibility of having to lead the team on the field now. And people were saying like Pogba plays some of his best soccer when he's playing for the national team for France. And part of it is he's surrounded by so many great players, great leaders. He doesn't have to do that role there. And so here's a good example of a player who is very skilled, but probably not comfortable being the leader, right? I think Pogba can lead and lead in his own way, but he's not the leader. And that's not in his makeup. And he'll play better, and he has played better when he's not viewed as the leader. And I think there's a good lesson there, that the best players don't always make the best captains, right? It's again, it's knowing your personnel, and sometimes it's going to be that best player, other times it's not, and that's okay. It's more about, I think, finding a leader or leaders who are well respected within the dressing room. I think that's key.
Yeah, and I think Pogba is a perfect example because before Bruno got to Man U, he was always hinting that he wants out of Man U. He wants to be sold somewhere. And I think playing in a market like Manchester United, where like that demand for being a leader, even though you're just not, it's kind of like Phil Kessel in Toronto. It's like, hey, I just want to go about my business, creating offense, scoring goals. Don't put that pressure on me. But it's the same way in Manchester United. And then Bruno comes along and now he's saying he wants to stay. He doesn't want to leave anymore. And I guess he's more comfortable because now he's thriving in that role that he is at his best at.
right. And there's not that pressure on him to be the, like I said, the leader. And I think Pogba will lead in his own way and do his
Yeah.
own thing. And that's probably what's best for him. Right. And it's good that, it worked out this way for Manchester United, that you take away that pressure. Whereas Bruno Fernandes he loves it. He seems to be eating it up. He wants the spotlight on him. He doesn't mind it, and it probably helps Pogba and maybe other players on the team as well. Deflect some of that or share that leadership, right? Because on a team like United, they're big brand, they're a big club, high expectations, and yet still a young club. They're rebuilding. They're a young club, and you got players like Marcus Rashford, who still a young player, but seems to be developing into a leader. And we saw during the pandemic him, going against the Prime Minister Boris Johnson and some of the cutbacks that were going to happen there, and he fought against it, and he actually turned the decision around for that funding for a meal program. So again, I think some players will thrive under that and want to be it when they're skilled, and some who it's just not in them, and that's okay. They'll
Yeah.
do it differently.
Yeah, absolutely. So, with almost every human trait, people always debate whether leadership is one of them. And people debate whether it's something you're born with or something that you can develop. And I'm not going to ask you whether it's nature or nurture, because that's not fair to ask you. It's nobody knows. And also, we've learned that time and time again, the answer to that question is that in most cases, it's both.
Yeah.
But I do want to ask you, how much of being a leader do you think is inherent and how much of it is taught? Like, do you still need a certain baseline of inherent abilities, and then on top of that you can build with things that are you're taught? Or how does that work in your opinion, your expertise?
Yeah. Well, I guess I can't dodge the question, right? Like,
Yeah, I told you I won't ask you the question, but then I
yeah,
asked you the question anyway.
yeah.
Yeah.
So nature versus nurture.
Yeah, yeah.
What I teach in my leadership in sport class is it's a bit of both. Hard to give the percentage of what it is, but it's both. And I think what we just talked about, whether it's Connor McDavid or Paul Pogba, there are some players who want it, right? And so perhaps that's more the nature, right? They think it's important, they value it, it's in them, okay? And that's just a trait that they have. And for others, and probably for a lot of us, it's developed, right? It's and that's the part that I focus in on a lot, because I can't change how you were, raised, or how what your situation was growing up, but I can teach you and I can develop it. And so I think everyone has that capacity to to develop it. We can teach it. And so I focus a lot more of my energy on what we can control, because that's what we do as sport psychology, consultants and researchers, is focus on the controllables. And that's one we can control, that we can develop this. So I take that perspective. And but you also have to understand, and that's why I talked earlier about some people don't want to be leaders, but we can still teach them leadership as the skill, right? And develop that, even though we know they don't want to be the next captain or next leader, like you said, the Phil Kessel, right? But we can still teach Phil Kessel what leadership is and how to do it, and he'll probably do it, but he doesn't want to be the main leader or one of the main leaders, right? Let him do his thing, let him score. That's what he's paid to do, and he's happy doing that. But we can still teach him these life skills. So yeah, it can be taught. It can be taught to anyone. And we take the perspective that, yeah, when we do teach it to everyone, it makes for a better functioning team. And so we try to increase cohesion, reduce conflict, create better communication, create better team confidence, more satisfaction. So there's a lot of benefit to this.
Yeah, and so I suppose, like, one way to look at it is whether how much is nature, how much is nurture, or whether it's one or the other. Maybe that all depends on to what extent do you want to develop this person to be a leader? Like, to what extent of leadership do you want them to achieve? Just have basic leadership skills? Well, okay, that's going to be different than if you want to groom someone to be the face of the team and the big leader.
Yeah, I think you're right on that front. And again, I believe the solution is develop as many people as you can, develop everyone as you can. You're knowing full well that not everyone's going to develop into the leader or a core part of that leadership group, but nonetheless, you're going to have athletes who are, better teammates. And when you have better teammates, we know that helps performance, right? That people can get along better, they can communicate better, they can be more trustworthy, so they can do their part. They can, we talk a lot about, knowing your role. This is one way we can do that, because we know knowing your role, accepting your role, and doing it well can help with performance as well. So this is one way of doing that as well.
Yeah. And so I want to end on this because I would like to hear your thoughts from someone who's a leadership expert. What are some myths or misconceptions about leadership out there that are common in sports or outside of sports even, that you hear all the time, but from your knowledge that it's either not true or it's misunderstood?
Yeah, and I think we touched upon a lot of them, today. Is one, that the best players are going to be your leaders, because they're not always going to be that. And a good example of that was when, the Toronto Maple Leafs brought in Patrick Marleau, right? They brought him in for what we would call, veteran leadership. He was, a player who was, mid-30s, skill set, probably in decline to some degree, not what he once was with, when he was with San Jose. But yet, he was brought in to provide that leadership for a young group of players, right? When the team needed that, right? And so again, not the best player. So there's that myth of it has to be the best player. No, here we've got a good example in Patrick Marleau, someone with a wealth of experience, and that's important, right? And he was, I think, highly valued and respected. Problem was, he was, it hurt their salary cap, right? But without the salary cap in play, he was quite valued within that within that dressing room. So that would be one kind of myth I would dispel, is that the best players don't necessarily make the best leaders. The second thing is, again, from this nurture nature kind of perspective, I don't think it's one or the other. That there's going to be a bit of both in that. But having said that, I do believe we can develop it. Even those who are probably the most reluctant, we can make them better. And whether they go into a leadership role down the road, who knows? But at least we've given them some positive, good life skills. And then probably lastly is the notion that there's the one leader is going to carry a club, a team. What we have shown repeatedly is it's really a collective. And it's nice to hear nowadays when teams talk about a leadership core or leadership group. I think that's, well, not that I think, I know that that's what's the right thing to happen. And it's good that we're seeing it, and not all the responsibility and all that pressure thrust onto one or two people within the club.
Doing it by committee is the way to go.
Yeah. Doing it by committee is a good way.
Yeah.
Very effective.
Yes. And I think Patrick Marleau is actually a perfect example because, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think when he was in San Jose, he was given the captaincy at some point and then stripped of the captaincy. And I think he was just expected to display this sort of type of leadership that he just didn't have within him. Maybe he had a different idea of leadership, had a different type of leadership that he's best at performing. And maybe that was misunderstood and they took away the captaincy from him.
Yeah, no, I don't know. Obviously, don't know the details of what happened in that situation. But you're right. He was the captain. He was stripped of that captaincy, and a lot of times when that happens, you would expect the player to demand a trade.
Mm-hmm.
They won out. They were obviously could be perceived as being insulted, or that they're no longer viewed as being important for that club. But he no, he went back, not back to the rank and file, but maybe it suited more of what he thought leadership was and what he could do for the club, and not necessarily that maybe the seat just wasn't for him. Like I don't know, but I don't doubt for a second that with or without the C, Marlowe was still providing leadership. And that's why I think at times it can be overrated, that having the C or the A on your jersey. I think another great example with Wayne Gretzky. I think when he went to the Rangers, he wasn't a captain or assistant captain, but I'm sure he still provided leadership to that team, right? I mean, he's the greatest player of all time. I'm sure he's got things to pass on to his teammates. So again, you don't need that, right? And maybe in Marlowe's case, it was as simple as that's not how I lead, and that's not how I want to lead, and this is what I'm more comfortable with.
Yeah, and I think I read Jeremy Roenick's book a long time ago, and he mentioned in his book how when he was in San Jose with at the same time that Marlowe was, he was so upset with Marlowe, and he showed up at his house and he told him, "You're not vocal enough. You don't, you don't lead verbally, kind of thing. You just go about your business. You're soft spoken." And that was his issue with Marlowe being one of the leaders. And I think maybe what Roenick didn't understand is like that type of leadership is not within Marlowe, but he is clearly a good mentor. I mean, from what we've seen with the Leafs, like he clearly developed really good relationships with his teammates and cared for them. And so maybe he just shines as a leader in that capacity, but it's unfair to expect him to be that vocal leader because it's unfair to expect everyone to have all those qualities in one person.
Correct. And we saw that in Toronto, right? He was a leader. I don't think he was all that much in front of the media all that much, but what he did for Austin Matthews and Mitch Marner, I think was awesome, right? He had them living at his house, really teaching them how to be professionals, how to take care of yourself, and doing it in his way. And I think that's what we got to, I think GMs, coaches, even us fans, we have to realize that players, let them lead in a way that they're comfortable and how they can serve the club the best. And if that means you're not going to be the rah vocal leader, that's okay. Let someone else do that. And maybe that's what Roenick should have been doing. Maybe that was more his role, in the case of San Jose. And but let Marlowe maybe lead more by example. He's probably more that quiet type of leader. So but yet can still be very effective, and that's why it takes probably it takes more than one. That leadership by committee is probably more important.
Yeah, and I think there's a really important lesson to draw here, even outside of sports and just organizational settings everywhere. Is like maybe don't force a certain type of leadership quality on one person because you expect them to have it. Let them display the type of leadership that they're most comfortable with and that they're the best at, and leave the other qualities and other behaviors to other leaders.
100%. I think that's a very sage advice. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, before we end, is there anything you would like to promote or mention? Maybe Twitter handle. Where can people find you?
Yeah, on Twitter.
Yeah.
Todd Loughead is my Twitter handle. I'm not super active on social media, but I do put things up there from time to time. We have a website, uwindsor.ca/sports psychology, where it highlights a lot of the research that we're doing in our lab, and along with what the students are doing. I think they're really the engines that drive a lot of this. I've been blessed to work with great graduate students over the years, and they get me thinking about leadership in different ways and different perspectives. And so check that out and see what they're doing. I think it's wonderful work, and they really help innovate and push the boundaries of what we're doing with leadership in sport.
So what do you guys have in the works these days? What kind of projects are you looking at?
Well, one that's probably very topical right now with COVID is that we just finished collecting data on COVID-19, like a leadership in crisis, and what it looks like within our some of our sport teams right now, and how the leadership had to adapt during the crisis, and what it looked like, and who was doing what, and so we're just starting to. Well, we're in the middle of transcribing those interviews. So we did a qualitative piece there. So I think that's going to be very timely. We're doing stuff on this idea of shared leadership, but how coaches can facilitate it and develop it within their teams. And what we found there was pretty neat, in that there's not one way to do it. There's not one size fits all. Coaches do it differently, and they promote it differently, and they foster it differently. And the nice part was it was contingent upon the players on their team and what they had. What would work with a young team might necessarily wouldn't work with a veteran team. And so the shared leadership looks quite differently in that case. So we're working on that. We doing some stuff on authentic leadership as well. And that's been pretty awesome so far. This idea of being authentic and genuine is, I think we can do all these behaviors well, but if we're not genuine or authentic, then we're probably not as effective. And so we're doing some work on that front. So we're a busy lab. We try to stay busy and stay relevant, and do research that's the cliche, cutting edge and innovative. And I really do believe that, though. I'm really proud of what we're doing here, and the students who are doing it are just simply amazing. They push me to be a better leader, a better mentor, a better advisor, and but ultimately what it does, it helps our teams, our athletes perform better. So kudos to them.
That's good stuff. You guys got a lot on the go, and hopefully once you wrap up a lot of those projects, we'll do round 2 and you can recap us on what you found. That'd be awesome.
Maybe the one thing I did forget to mention, and we're trying to develop these leadership behaviors, and our previous, probably last 5-6 years, what we showed was that we can develop them. But the one thing, what wasn't happening was the reach. We weren't reaching out, hitting a lot of people. And, we had started just prior to COVID using these online platforms to try to deliver some of our programs. So that way we can reach athletes from, anywhere in the world right now, right? With whether it's Zoom or Skype or Teams or, whatever platform it is. So we're going to try to, create some of these online, platforms. So the idea is to try to reach as many athletes and coaches as we can to try to, train and help people be better leaders. So that's what's happening next now. So it's all pretty exciting stuff.